I am back from up the country, very sorry that I went, seeking for the southern poet's land, whereon to pitch my tent. I have lost a lot of idols, which were broken on the track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. Further out may be the pleasant scenes of which our poets boast, but I think the country's rather more inviting round the coast. Anyway, I'll stay at present at a boarding house in town, drinking beer and lemon squashes, taking baths, and cooling down. Up the Country is a popular poem by the Australian writer and poet Henry Lawson. It was first published in the Bulletin magazine on the 9th of July, 1892, under the title Borderland, and it started something called the Bulletin Debate, a series of poems by both Lawson and Andrew Barton or Banjo Patterson about the true nature of life in the Australian bush. Henry Lawson is a celebrated Australian short story writer and poet. He was born near Grenfell, New South Wales on the 17th of June in 1867. His childhood was spent on a small section at Erundi, New South Wales, and was unhappy and difficult. His parents struggled with poverty, drought, and an unsuccessful marriage. Henry was called Barmy by his classmates and was lonely and ostracized at school. At the age of 13, he got a terrible ear infection, which resulted in partial hearing loss, which deteriorated into deafness and forced Henry to leave school and work on the farm to help his father as a carpenter. After his parents separated in 1883, Henry's mother, Louisa Lawson, moved to Sydney. She became involved in the women's rights movement and later worked as a writer and publisher. She set up her own printing press and called it The Dawn in 1888. Henry eventually joined Louisa in Sydney, and he found work as an apprentice coach painter at Clyde during the day, and in the evenings attended night school. A love of literature had been nourished in Henry by Louisa, and he began to write around this time. His first poem, Song of the Republic, was published by the Bulletin in 1887, and his short story, His Father's Mate, was published in 1888. He also began drinking, something which was to afflict him for the rest of his life. Despite the growing popularity of his poetry and prose, Lawson could not earn enough money to support himself through writing and had to find work wherever he could. In 1890, he moved to Brisbane to write for Boomerang, an important labor newsletter, until it closed in 1892. This job had a formative influence on his writing and turned out to be the only full-time writing job he ever held in his life. Encouraged by J.F. Archibald, the editor of the Bulletin, Lawson then went to Bourke and spent a year traveling the outback with swag, doing unskilled jobs in shearing sheds. His experience in the bush provided much of the inspiration and many of the characters for later stories and sketches. When Henry returned from the bush, he was greeted with a copy of an English newspaper, the London Spectator. In it, he found a poem called My Country, written by an Australian poet, Dorothea McKellar. She had written it in England, homesick for her Australian home. It was published under the title Core of My Heart. The poem was an instant success because of its wild and untamed backdrop, the Australian outback. Henry had just returned from the bush and had seen everything in bush poverty. He had suffered hardship, unemployment. Henry considered the poem to be a very romantic vision of the Australian outback and decided to say so. Because he had returned to the Bulletin, he enlisted the help of fellow writer Banjo Paterson. On the 23rd of July, 1892, Paterson published his reply to Lawson's poem, Up the Country, entitled In Defense of the Bush. While Lawson had accused writers such as Paterson of being city bushmen, Paterson countered by claiming that Lawson's view of bush life was full of doom and gloom. He finished his poem with the line, "For the bush will never suit you, and you will never suit the bush." While readers thought that the debate was genuine, actually, Banjo and Henry were having a good time. Later, Banjo Paterson recalled the Bulletin debate. He said, "Henry Lawson was a man of remarkable insight in some things and of extraordinary simplicity in others. We were both looking for the same reef, if you get what I mean, but I had done prospecting on horseback with my meals cooked for me. One day, Lawson suggested we ride against each other, he putting the bush from his point of view, and I putting it from mine. We ought to do pretty well out of it," he said. "We ought to be able to get in 3 or 4 sets of verses before they stop us." This suited me all right, for we were working on space and the pay was very small, so we slam-banged away at each other for weeks and weeks, not until they stopped us, but until we ran out of material. Lawson is now revered as a great or important poet in Australians' history. He is on a postage stamp and was the first man that was not royalty to be on a note or Australian dollar. But if you ask Australians what Henry Lawson is most known for, they will tell you it is his poetry, specifically from Up the Country. I am back from up the country where I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. I have shattered many idols out along the dusty track, burnt a lot of fancy verses, and I'm glad that I am back. I believe the southern poet's dream will not be realized till the plains are irrigated and the land is humanized. I intend to stay at present, as I said before, in town, drinking beer and lemon squashes, taking baths and cooling down.